So welcome back to our lecture on scope and modularity of functions. So what we mean by scope is we mean the idea of if you're inside of a function and you do something to a variable, how broadly will that affect it? And the default is you're very isolated. We call it namespacing. So you can have a variable x out in the outside world and you can have a variable x inside of a function and they don't affect each other. So that's the normal scope, right? So even though in this case I have the normal scope is there's kind of this isolation, and you can either pass stuff in and get it out by a return, and then sort of what happens in here is just hidden. It's like isolated. And in this case, because I've got val outside and I've got val inside, it seems as though they're a match, but they're not the same thing because they don't cross this boundary. And so if we look at this code and we take a look at it, we see that it comes in, val is 10, then it runs this code, comes in this val, which is different. You can say like this val is the val, try zap underscore val, because it's the one inside try zap. Doesn't work that way. And so we set it to 100 here, and we come back, and it's still in this outer context. So there's outer scope and inner scope. This one got set to 100, it really did. But outside, it stayed 10. And so that's normal, and that's exactly what you want, because you might have very different programmers writing this code than this code, and you don't want the choice of variable names inside that function to have any effect on the outside world, because a lot of people use the variable I for counters, or count for counters, or who knows what. And so you just don't want to do that. On the other hand, sometimes you want to very explicitly share the namespace, and you have to do this on a variable by variable basis. You can't say that all the variables in this function are shared with the outside world, but you can say that a particular one is. And the way you do that is with this global. You say GlobalVal, and so that says that this particular value, we have this little thing, it's all isolated, you have kind of the in of the parameters and the outer return, but val has this special little road to the outside world. So val is connected to the val in the global scope, and this is the global scope out here that's not inside any function. And so that just means that these two things are connected. And so we set the global val to 10 here, we run zap, comes in here, it runs this, and we set the global val to 100, and that is the same thing. And so when we come back, it's 100. And so that just means that you're sharing it. And of course, be very careful. This is really it means that your functions begin to have side effects, and it should be something that you and the outside world programmer, if you're different, need to greatly agree on. Because if you start making global $i, if you put global $i and people start using your code and you're changing they're in a loop outside here and you put a loop in here and then their loop blows up because you changed the value of I, they're not going to be very happy with you. So don't ever do that. As a matter of fact, we just want to use these things so rarely because you want to do anything but that. If you can pass it as a parameter, or you can send it back as a return value, and if you want to change it, you pass it by reference. If you really, after all those things, can't think that you think you just can't do it with anything but a global variable, I tend to write really long, ugly global variable names to sort of punish myself for even thinking about using them in the first place. But sometimes they're the way to solve it. They really are. It's not elegant, but you got this problem and you got to pass something and it's not really part of the return value and you want to be able to peek in to see what the last error. You see things in PHP like, show me the last error. Well, that's got some global value, but somebody made it a really long thing. I tend to use all uppercase and make them long and use underscores and have them multiple words, just so that within my function, I don't unintentionally hit one of your variables like $x or $line or $handle or $JSON or something like that. I never would do that. It's got to be super long. And then when I document it, I say, oh, and this touches this global variable and sets this. And if you want to look at it, you can look at it. Sometimes I pass information into functions and sometimes I take information out of functions with global variables, but I use them very, very rarely. And when I do, I give them horribly long names. So one of the things that we do inside PHP is PHP evolves over time, and that's nice. PHP didn't have object-oriented capabilities, and then it did. Certain cool functions that people had to write over and over again eventually were added, but each of these things were added at a particular version of PHP, and so you don't know what version you're running. And often we write code that we're going to share with other people, and so we have to check sometimes what version we have. Or perhaps you just have a function. And I've got a bunch of code like this. Over time you can throw it away because everyone's version catches up. But for example, array combine doesn't exist in all values of PHP. And you can call this function called function exist. That's a function. It's kind of inception because we're going all the way down. You say, hey, does this function exist? And you pass in a string, so it's not like a function reference. And it looks in all the functions and finds if it's there. If it is, it gets back a true, otherwise a false. Now usually you don't just print this echo out. Usually what you do actually is you define the function. You do nothing here. And then you actually define the function. And so it's a way for you to put in backwards compatibility code. If you want to use a function that may or may not exist in the version your customers are going to be running, you can say if it doesn't exist, define it. And then write in PHP something that does what array combine does. And then when they run it on a version of PHP that has array combine built into it, then they just start using the default one. And then, like I say, a few years later, you throw the code away because you say, I've got to use PHP 7 for everything. And there is some stuff between PHP, even in the versions of PHP 5 that were added, and then coming to PHP 7, which is a great language, but we got to be careful because not everyone is running PHP 7. So when you look at the documentation of PHP on the php.net, you will see that it tells you often what versions this particular function works in. And so this one is version greater than PHP 4.0.7, and at this point everyone's at least on PHP 5. But again, so this one you probably wouldn't want to do, but you get the idea that they're trying to communicate to you that this is not in every single version, and so that's a function there. The other thing that's interesting is PHP is sort of a moving target. We will have your desktop PHP, which will be a particular version with a particular set of plugins, and then you'll move it to a server, and then something will stop working. And you're like, well, what version am I running on this server? What functions? And it just, sometimes you have to probe the implementation of PHP or the instance of PHP that you're working with. And so they have built into PHP this function called PHP Info, and literally you will commonly write this 3-line thing in a PHP file to dump out the PHP internal configuration. And it's a lot of information. And if you did my very first assignment, you've actually already looked at it, because we wanted to figure out if display errors was on or off, and we wanted to make sure display errors was on. By the way, quick little advertisement, please make sure display errors is on for all your sanity when writing PHP. And so those are just some screenshots that come out of this, and it tells about where it was compiled, what options it has. It goes into detail about what things are in it, what software is configured as part of your PHP, what's missing, what's present, all your display settings, etc., 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 etc. And so it's super useful as you're trying to say, why doesn't this thing work the way that I'm expecting it to work? And so that's, you often have to do that to figure out something. And all that output, all those tables and little gray and blue, that all comes out. That's all just coming out of that function. Literally, you write 3 lines of code and it dumps all this stuff out for the configuration. And that's because it turns out to be important from time to time for you to kind of peer into your PHP environment. So now let's talk a little bit about programming in multiple files. And it's kind of like functions, but it's also just a version of modularity. And so there's a couple of PHP statements that allow you in one PHP file to pull in the contents of another PHP file. There are 4 basic variations. There's the include and the require. The difference between include and require is include is a non-fatal error, but often your PHP will complain anyways. So sometimes you have to put this in an if statement to see if you really want it to be optional. You have to say if file exists to see if it's there and then include it. The more interesting ones are the once versions. And so usually if you're pulling something like the header of a document in, you just use the include to say I want to put it here. But if you're pulling in a library code that's just a bunch of functions or maybe some objects that are being defined, you can use the require once. And what that does is if it's above you somehow already been required, don't require it again. And so it just is a way to say that you can say, I need this set of library functions, and then later maybe in another library function says, I need this same set of library functions. And PHP will figure out if it's already been included and then not include it twice, which is a really nice feature. So let's talk a little bit about how you might use this as you're developing a website. So here is web applications for everybody, my happy little website. And as you move between, and you come here and you're on this page, and then you click here and you go to this page. And it looks like this top navigation bit just doesn't change. It looks like a desktop application. And so it really does change the full request response cycle. Now I'm not talking about Ajax or in-browser stuff, but in this case the URL changed. We went from one URL to another URL. A full request response cycle happened, but we want to basically put the same stuff at the top on every page. Could be hundreds of pages literally. And so how do we do that? Well, that's what we use these requires for, or includes or requires. In this case, require wouldn't matter. Require once, it doesn't really matter because we're going to demand them. So what I've built is I have built in this particular website, in the same folder as index.php, I've got a file called top.php and nav.php. So at top.php, it doesn't produce any output. It's all the CSS and JavaScript and setup. The header part and the title of the page and all that comes out. And then the nav.php issues the navigation bit. So the nav.php is all this part. And then I'm done, and I'm going to have the body of the document that comes up here. That's this body. And then I've got some stuff that's got to be at the end of every page, so I switch back into PHP, and then I require some footer. So there's an index.php, a top.php, a nav.php, a foot.php, and they're all in the same folder. And now I've separated these things out into modules. Sometimes you could make these functions, and as we increasingly move towards more object-oriented, you'll see some code that uses functions for this. But the classic way to do this is with require statements. So now here's another page, right? Here's the install.php. And so what the install.php does is it requires that same top to get the CSS and JavaScript environment right, the same nav to put out the pretty little nav bar, and then we have slightly different HTML, which is the body of it, the part that you see, and then we make sure we require the footer, which in this case, if you go down far enough, I think this one has a copyright on it, and some stuff so that there's a copyright at the bottom of every page, and there's a little bit of JavaScript that happens at the bottom of every page, and like analytics tracking and stuff like that. So you see this pattern where now you just keep replacing this middle part, and that's really the content of the website. This middle part gets replaced over and over and over as you move from one page to another. And so that's one of the ways that we do these pages that have to have repeating elements on them over and over. And so that's a quick run through functions in PHP, how we make new functions, the different forms of passing like default values, and also including and requiring files, as well as scoping and dealing with the fact that PHP is changing, how to figure out what's in your PHP, what version you're running using PHP Info, and then using function exists to sort of patch your PHP if certain things are not present in the version of PHP that you're using. Hope you found this useful. Cheers.